Shadow Hack. Chapter 511, Heavens Explode. All of a sudden, Li Yunmu understood. It seemed that the heavenly platform obtained by him from the island dimensional space was an extremely rare treasure which had been passed down from ancient times and couldn't be obtained without a stroke of luck. Master, they are about to open the passage between the two worlds. It will be too late if we don't stop them now. At some point in time, Li Qinghong had caught up with him and was looking before them with a hint of anxiousness in her cold face. After she had learned about the resurrection of an ancient god from Li Yunmu, she clearly understood what would happen if these people opened a passage to Earth. She wasn't afraid that they would invade Earth, but that their descent would provide the ancient god with a great opportunity to steal a perfectly good body. Don't be anxious, let's wait for a bit more. They still haven't started on the most important part. With his true sight, Li Yunmu easily saw through the workings of the nefarious spell formation. A hint of unexplainable craziness flashed through his eyes whilst he was waited for the most optimum timing. Originally, he had only intended to destroy the enemy's plan and use ghostly image substitution to escape the attacks of the 5 sage flux experts. This was the best scenario in his mind. However, after seeing that the opponent offering sacrifices to a demonic spirit, another thought emerged in his mind. Clearly, they were about to offer the sacrifices to some demonic spirit, but what would happen if at the most crucial moment, they were stolen by Li Yunmu? What would be the consequences of that? Li Yunmu didn't know the answer to that question. But he was aware that if he truly did that, there would be two main possibilities in regards to what would happen next. The first possibility was that the terrifying demonic spirit would become furious after the transaction broke off. The entire upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley would then be devoured for angering the demonic spirit. Then there was the second possibility that the fury of the demonic spirit would descend only upon Li Yunmu, who had interrupted the transaction. Naturally, given that the demonic spirit was a deity, there was another possibility that it would eliminate everyone present without any exception. Soon, the system performed some calculations and agreed on Li Yunmu's opinion, which was that the third possibility had the highest chance of occurring. The fury would descend on all the people present, without any differentiation. After obtaining this result, Li Yunmu's heart began to pound fiercely. He began to hesitate. Before him was clearly a rare opportunity, but he needed to offer himself as the price to drag down the entire Black Spirit Valley in one go. But could he possibly resist the fury of a genuine demon god? Li Yunmu didn't have any plan in mind, but he could only make the choice. This is the only opportunity. Li Yunmu was a relatively decisive person. He had made the decision to gamble before, like with his Azure Dragon expert armor, and he now chose to gamble again, whether he could resist this calamity or not. His only advantage was that being an outsider, he held the initiative and wouldn't receive any backlash. After all, he hadn't poured the least bit of his flux energy into the sacrificial offering. Don't leave the 1-meter radius around me. I'm preparing to take action. After making the decision in his heart, Li Yunmu didn't think much more because the sacrificial offering had finally reached the most crucial moment. As it happened, a large amount of blood from the young women converged at the center from all directions while the upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley continued to offer their energy in a steady flow. At this instant, intense energy fluctuations gradually appeared above the top of the altar. Under the effect of an enormous amount of demonic energy, the passage to the earth which had been concealed here began to open. The aim of Zhanhua and his people was to exploit the large amount of energy to open the passage completely. At this moment, the sky of the Black Spirit world was covered by a wave of extremely sinister presence. Even Li Yunmu, whose strength had greatly increased, felt his mind fill with extreme resentment and chaos just by trying to check out the presence, while it was even worse for Li Qinghong. An indescribable but hard to control killing intent attacked his brain. His eyes gradually turned red, and he subconsciously looked at the woman standing near him. At that instant, he had an intense urge to throw her on the ground and ruthlessly tear her to shreds, before eating large mouthfuls of her flesh. Blue light brightly shone in his mind at that moment, and the blue serpent dragon intruded forcefully into his thoughts. It opened its bloody mouth and fiercely absorbed the demonic presence. Instantly, Li Yunmu's mind began to clear up. After sobering up, he felt a chill run down his spine. The demonic spirit's presence was extremely terrifying. He had almost failed in his task because of it. Li Qinghong's situation was even worse. Her face had turned completely red. She was flushed and perspiring profusely. She had crouched down and was tightly holding both her legs close to her chest, looking like a ball. Clearly, she had lost against the demonic presence. Li Yunmu then struck the back of her head and made her lose consciousness. The time is now. After sobering up, Li Yunmu discovered that at some point in time, an enormous phantom had appeared above the sacrificial altar. The phantom opened its blood-red eyes as if attentively watching everything that was happening underneath it. Its gaze was filled with cruelty and desire to kill. The faint rain falling all over the black spirit world turned red from black. As the demonic spirit's phantom descended, the passage to earth continued to materialize. The entire upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley as well as Zhanhua grew extremely excited as they watched the passage becoming increasingly more solid without blinking. At that moment, Li Yunmu, who was being protected by the shield of the blue serpent dragon, realized what was happening. It wasn't too early nor too late, but precisely the exact time. Without much thought, he took out the bottle of sacred life water which contained the final 3 drops, since 30 of them had been used in congealing equals Azure Dragon Expert Armor. Go, devour them, eliminate everything. A hint of madness flashed in Li Yunmu's eyes. He waved his hand at the speed of a bullet, and the sacred life water instantly fell on a body of a young girl. It then followed her blood and went into the great spell. 1 drop of sacred life water could save a person, but sometimes, it could also kill people. And that time was now, for the sacred life water had a divine attribute. It was an innate nemesis of demonic creatures. And sure enough, when the drop of sacred life water sneaked into the great spell of blood sacrifice, it didn't take even a second for a heaven-shaking miserable howl to echo in everyone's consciousness. See, humans, you've become so brazen that you dare to plot against this god. I want all of you dead. You will die, be exterminated. Chapter 512, Backlash. 1 drop of sacred life water was like a bucket of explosives. The entire black spirit world seemed to be trembling because of the roar of the unprecedentedly powerful beast. As soon as Li Yunmu's keen senses felt the descent of the fury which made his blood run dry, he grabbed Li Qinghong, who had already sobered up and was by his side. He then turned around and ran away. Ghostly image substitution. At this instant, Li Yunmu didn't dare hold anything back while confronting the unknown demonic spirit of the black spirit world. He used his most important skill in the first moments, without caring for the fact that it was an extremely strong fleeing technique in earth. In a flash, Li Yunmu transformed into a ray of light and fled toward the entrance of the black spirit world. By then, the people who had participated in the sinister sacrificial offering had already begun to suffer the backlash because of the drop of divine sacred life water. While Li Yunmu used the opportunity to flee straight away, all the important people of Black Spirit Valley at the blood sacrifice altar were suffering the backlash because of the evil spirit's fury and the offering method. A blood-red fog permeated into the bodies, without anyone being an exception. Regardless of whether it were the several core disciples who were great flux experts or the 5 elders who had already entered into the sage flux expert lever, all of them repeatedly coughed out big mouthfuls of blood. The deep red blood terrified them. The blood which they were coughing because of the backlash didn't seem to be ordinary blood, but rather the blood from their heart. They continued to cough mouthfuls of heart's blood, unable to control themselves until the formidable great flux energy fluctuations coming from their bodies were completely eliminated. 10 majestic great flux experts perished because of one wave of backlash. It has to be known that if they were on Earth, then even though they were only 3rd-7th rank great flux experts here, their strength was comparable to flux sages on Earth. Yet the lives of these formidable people were lost without any protest or begging for life. When Li Yunmu, who had already fled far away, turned around and saw this scene, his heart instantly turned cold. Ancient God, this was the power of ancient God realm. Although the sinister ancient God was definitely far from his peak strength and his true body hadn't genuinely descended, he could exterminate great flux experts with just the backlash from the sacrificial offering. However, the most terrifying fact wasn't that 10 great flux experts had died, for the number continuing growing. Even the 5 sage flux experts of Black Spirit Valley couldn't hold it back anymore. Puh, 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 puh. They continued coughing out mouthfuls after mouthfuls of blood. Until finally, their eyes gradually lost their shine, and the men around of vitality. The 5 sage flux experts all followed in the footsteps of the great flux experts and perished. But saying that everyone was lost would be wrong. There was still a final flux expert who continued to staunchly resist. A dense thick layer of black mist enveloped his body, firmly defending him. If Li Yunmu's guess wasn't wrong, then that sage flux expert was the world master of Black Spirit Valley. At that moment, the power of the whole Black Spirit world was shielding him. Despite that, when confronted with a genuine god's furious backlash, his sturdy black shield gradually began to fluctuate intensely. Even more terrifying fact which caused Li Yunmu's blood to run cold was that the heart's blood which the formidable experts of Black Spirit Valley had coughed out seemed to have suddenly come alive. While lying on the smooth jade surface of the altar, the thick blood began to squirm as if it had suddenly developed consciousness. 1 drop, 2 drops, 3 drops, 100 drops, thousands of the coughed out blood converged. With a rumbling sound, they merged together. The next instant, a 3-meter-high blood-red human creature whose entire body was formed from blood stood on the altar. Humans, you will all die. None of you will escape. When the crimson monster opened its mouth, it quietly vented its fury toward the Black Spirit world. Right then, it seemed to have sensed the little insect named Li Yunmu. With a loud howl, the crimson monster scattered and returned to being blood drops which filled the entire sky. They rushed after Li Yunmu. At this moment, Li Yunmu took in a shuddering breath. He was almost at the point of weeping. If he'd known that the upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley paid their blood sacrifices to such a terrifying demonic god, then even if someone threatened to kill him, he still wouldn't use such a method to court disaster. He would have never broke down the passage to Earth like this if he'd had any idea what he was doing. After using ghostly image substitution, his speed became extremely fast. It was especially so in the special environment of the Black Spirit world. The movement speed of the black line attained the pinnacle there. It surpassed the usual speed when using this technique by a few folds. This was the fastest speed with which Li Yunmu had ever erupted. But the crimson monster which had transformed into blood rain to chase and kill him was even faster. If being truthful, its speed was on a completely different level. The next moment, a large amount of blood rain descended in front of the fleeing Li Yunmu. One after another, the drops gathered together in a depression on the ground. Human, you destroyed my offering. I want to eat you. The head of the crimson monster floated out from the depression in the ground. It opened its mouth and swallowed Li Yunmu, who was a black ray, together with Li Qinghong. But the blood monster wasn't finished with just that. Upon gulping them down, it tried to sense for any other life forms in the Black Spirit world. It wanted to eat and swallow everyone inside. However, the next instant, it howled furiously, growing even more furious. That was because it discovered that the insect which had injured it previously surprisingly wasn't swallowed. Rather, he had appeared at the center of the altar. Such a majestic entity like it had surprisingly been played by a little insect. Boom! The crimson monster scattered and rose once more as countless blood drops to converge at the center of the altar. Upon returning to the center of the altar, Li Yunmu murmured to himself in a voice filled with helplessness, "There's nothing which can be done about it. Seems like this is the only method." Just before being swallowed, he had used the substitution technique of ghostly image substitution, otherwise, he and Li Qinghong would have been finished. The 11th shadow had been sacrificed for this. Chapter 513, Cheating Death Repeatedly. It was the first time Li Yunmu profoundly sensed helplessness. He had never felt so powerless, especially after congealing Azure Dragon expert armor. When confronted with a genuine deity-level evil spirit, Li Yunmu finally understood the disparity between them. Even if he still had 10 shadows which could substitute for him in death, he didn't have the least bit of confidence in being able to flee from the black spirit world. Even though the entrance had been in front of his eyes moments ago, he hadn't been confident in being able to escape successfully. It was even worse now, when the terrifying and nefarious spirit had focused all of its attention on him. He swept his gaze around, and his vision fell on the passage between the two worlds which had been destroyed by him. With ruthlessness, he rushed toward that passage to Earth which hadn't been thoroughly destroyed. But Li Yunmu hadn't forgotten about one matter. It was that there was still a person in the black spirit world who hadn't been affected by the blood monster. It was the person who hadn't possessed the qualifications to add his flux energy because his strength was too low. From the group of people of Black Spirit Valley, Zhang Wei was the only one who hadn't supplied any flux energy to establish the passage. Because of that, he wasn't the least bit affected by the backlash of the sacrificial offering. It was extremely fortunate, for it allowed him to survive thus far. When Zhang Wei felt that the sacrificial offering was ruined and saw the entire upper echelon of the black spirit world suffer a backlash while the furious evil spirit descended, he was extremely terrified. Given his strength, he was at the lowest level of the food chain. It was only his extreme luck that had allowed him to survive for this long. He shot behind a tree in the forest and blocked his presence completely, pretending to be dead. But all his actions weren't concealed from Li Yunmu, who was paying attention on him. He looked at Zhang Wei with unwillingness, then leaped into the passage to Earth which hadn't been established completely. Zhang Wei naturally saw that final unwilling gaze from Li Yunmu. He immediately recognized this person who had broken into the black spirit world and destroyed all their plans in one stroke, and who was now fleeing from the hunt of the terrifying spirit Li Yunmu. Impossible! He cried out in his heart. His strength wasn't sufficient to advance his cultivation and step into the great flux expert realm, but Li Yunmu, who had descended 2 years ago with him, had actually become so formidable. Was that even possible? How could he, Zhang Wei, have fallen so far behind? His heart filled with hatred and envy as well as unprecedented resentment. But at the same time, he also felt fortunate that this person, whom he hadn't even put in his eyes before, had followed his road into death. While he watched, Li Yunmu leaped into the channel between the two worlds due to being hunted by the terrifying spirit. Yet he, Zhang Wei, had successfully survived. Perhaps it was because of his weak energy fluctuations, or because he was just a small ant who had proposed the entire plan for the sacrificial offering. The demonic spirit surprisingly neglected his existence for the time being. He still continued to block his presence though, not daring to make any movements and hoping that the calamity would pass. He was convinced that the backlash would only last temporarily. It was impossible for the current situation to last eternally. When Li Yunmu jumped into the passage to Earth without caring for the consequences, the blood monster released a howl and the demonic spirit which had descended returned to its original place. Instantly, the black spirit world lost the effects of descent of the demonic spirit and regained its calmness. But now, the ground was filled with corpses, and the entire upper echelon of Black Spirit Valley lay dead. It was as if they were using their miserable condition to inform everyone that the backlash just then and the descent of nefarious spirit were all genuine. At that instant, Zhang Wei felt a sudden shock, and his heart began to pound loudly. He was watching with a deathly stare the silhouette at the center of the altar which was previously protected by the black mist, the master of Black Spirit Valley. The entire Black Spirit world is mine, and Black Spirit Valley is also mine. Perhaps I can't return to Earth and the blood sacrifice has been ruined, but this aftermath is also pretty good. Ha 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 ha. Zhang raised his head and began to howl wildly without any fear for the consequences. Even though Black Spirit Valley's Valley Master was protected by the Black Spirit World, he still couldn't survive the terrifying backlash and had perished. At that moment he, Zhang, was the ultimate winner. Step by step, he walked toward the body of the Valley Master with both craziness and nervousness. The whole inheritance of the Black Spirit World was on the Valley Master's body. Slowly, he got close. 10 meters, 5 meters, 3 meters, 1 meter, and Zhang stretched out his hand while laughing. However, the next instant, his smile froze because the corpse of the Valley Master suddenly moved and rolled over. Beneath him was a slender shadow which stood up at that moment. The shadow held gazes with Zhang, then its body flickered, becoming identical in body and shape to Li Yunmu. After it, the shadow faintly grinned at Zhang. It was just a smile, but Li Yunmu's expression was enough to frighten Zhang, instantly freezing his expression. "It's over, time to die." Suddenly, a voice echoed in Zhang's mind. The shadow lifted its fist and punched him with great force. "You, how could you hide from the perception of the evil spirit? How could it neglect you when you're so formidable? Impossible." Zhang was dead, but not willing to close his eyes, and he toppled to the ground wide-eyed. Until the time he took his last breath, Zhang couldn't understand, how had Li Yunmu concealed himself from the nefarious spirit. Moreover, he had personally witnessed Li Yunmu leap into the passage to earth with Li Qinghong. Li Yunmu had indeed crossed the sea with a trick and returned after jumping into the passage to earth. After killing Zhang in one move, he sat down on the ground and breathed a sigh of relief. This time, he had truly staked it all. With one mistake, his plan would have been foiled. Originally, Li Yunmu had believed that in the special circumstances of the origin world, he could use ghostly evasion to the extreme and use the 11 shadows to substitute for himself in case of death. In any case, he should have been able to flee from the Black Spirit World. But after he personally experienced the terrifying might of the demonic spirit and felt death approaching him, he didn't despair and at the most crucial junction went through his death so he could be reborn. He had indeed leaped into the passage to earth, but Shadow 10 and Shadow 9 had substituted for him and Li Qinghong. After that, he exploited Li Yun's new shadow skill, Shadow Carapace, to hide beneath the corpse of the Valley Master and thoroughly conceal himself from the furious demonic spirit. However, regardless of whether it was the technique to substitute death or shadow carapace used for concealment, neither of them would have been able to trick the evil spirit if it had been calm-headed. But none of that mattered. He had successfully survived the calamity. Chapter 514, Smashing the Treasury Protection Spell. After the destruction, the Black Spirit World was completely empty. But Li Yunmu didn't desire it greatly because although it was an independent dimensional space with a large amount of resources, it was clearly a demonic plane by nature. If Li Yunmu inherited it, his heart would definitely be polluted by the demonic energy. Yet if he just abandoned it, it would be a pity. Li Yunmu stopped near the corpse of the Valley Master of Black Spirit Valley and took out the object to pass on the boundary steel. Since he wasn't interested in it, he could only sell it. Although he didn't know how many contribution points exactly would this Black Spirit World fetch, he was certain that this time's unexpected harvest would bring him a lot of wealth. After that, Li Yunmu went to the corpses of other important people in Black Spirit Valley and increased his harvest. He obtained more than 10,000 contribution points as well as 3 source manuscripts of cultivation methods attributed to Black Spirit Valley. One of the 3 source manuscripts contained the method to create a large amount of demonic creatures by exploiting a compatible special environment. Although this secret manuscript was extremely sinister, Li Yunmu didn't have any dislike toward it. But it would be better to say that there was nothing like sinister or proper cultivation methods in the world, only nefarious and good users. The secret technique which explained the nurturing of demonic creatures couldn't influence his thoughts like inheriting the entire Black Spirit Valley would do. Thus, given how much he cherished such precious objects, he added it to his collection. After he assimilated the Ghost King armor into Azure Dragon Expert armor, it had obtained the ability to nurture the special environment fit to breed demonic creatures. The secret manuscript was exactly what was needed to exploit it to the peak. Let's go, seems like our work here is finished. Li Yunmu lighted a fire and burned the bodies of the 3,000 young women. After that, he picked the boundary steel and returned to the origin world without turning around for a look back. By then, Black Spirit Valley had been in chaos for a long time. All the disciples had already fled the headquarters of the third-tier sect, leaving it empty with various belongings spread everywhere. Clearly, the escapee disciples used the chaos to sweep anything of worth in Black Spirit Valley into their own hands. Given his level of strength, Li Yunmu didn't put the ordinary characters in his eyes. But whatever was said, Black Spirit Valley was still a third-tier power occupying the territory in the easternmost corner. The system successively dispatched several dimensional space eyes to aid in investigation, and in time, Li Yunmu found the treasury which housed all the precious materials of Black Spirit Valley. Every power had a treasury established at their base of operations, and it was always heavily guarded. Because of the requirements and practical applications, the treasuries weren't established in other dimensional spaces but in the origin world itself. Li Yunmu wasn't too late in arriving. Given that the sect treasury was extremely important for Black Spirit Valley and had many layers of protection, they had prevented the scattered sect disciples from robbing it clean during the chaos. The treasury was still untouched. When Li Yunmu hurried over, he encountered two groups of Black Spirit Valley's disciples. Both groups had several tens of people. They had great courage to not flee but focus their attention on Black Spirit Valley's treasury. Li Yunmu decided to show no mercy. Since they had the time to flee yet decided to remain because of their greed, he didn't need to hold back. While confronting the 70-80 inner disciples of Black Spirit Valley, Li Yunmu didn't act himself nor did he dispatch the shadows. He only waved his hand, and the numerous demonic creatures appeared at his side. They were the exact same demonic creatures which the shadows had previously eliminated in the Black Spirit world. Originally, they could only resurrect in the forest, which was the region from which the demonic energy originated. But because the Black Ghost King armor had assimilated into Azure Dragon Expert armor, it had gained a similar ability. Because of that, they were resurrected in the special space inside Azure Dragon Expert armor and were controlled by their new master, Li Yunmu. It has to be said that every ability or property of the innate expert armor was truly tyrannical. Li Yunmu waved his hand, and the next instant, hundreds of thousands of demonic creatures rushed toward the group of inner disciples of Black Spirit Valley. There wasn't any impartiality in this battle. There was soon another batch of Flux expert corpses in front of Li Yunmu. He placed them into the special Ghost King space in Azure Dragon expert armor. After some 2-3 months, if he used the secret technique to nurture demonic creatures on them, the number of demonic creatures under his command would increase by 70. System, do you have any methods to break the restrictions on the treasury of Black Spirit Valley? After he had eliminated all the hindrances, Li Yunmu looked at the treasury which had 11 layers of restrictions. Upon seeing them, he felt a headache coming. In reality, the treasury protecting spell had 15 layers of restrictions, but the 70-something flux experts had already broken through the weakest 4. As for the remaining 11, they clearly couldn't be cracked in a short while. Since the information regarding the spell formations of the origin world aren't complete, it would be difficult for the system to provide you with assistance. But the system would suggest for host to try using absolute power to smash through all restrictions. Given the sect's strength, the treasury protecting spell formations shouldn't pose any great threat to you. After some thought, the system couldn't offer any methods, but gave the advice to use the most effective method. That was to use simple strength to break through. What concerned spell formations, they were useless in front of true strength. It was impossible for a single person to be omnipotent. After hearing such advice, Li Yunmu nodded in agreement. Since the power of the restrictions wasn't a threat to his defense, then he might as well use brute force. He was very clear on the fact that didn't have much time left. The matter of him intruding upon Black Spirit Valley would definitely shake the powers in the vicinity, which would learn about it from the large numbers of disciples who had escaped. Recently, Li Yunmu's strength had seen a great increase. Although his apprehensions had diminished greatly and he didn't need to hide his strength like before, he was still extremely concerned about the other powers of the origin world. He was aware that even a second-tier power had a deity-level powerhouse protecting them, and after experiencing the power of an ancient god-level powerhouse, he was aware of the disparity between the strength of an ancient god and a deity. When the demonic god's spirit had descended, it hadn't displayed its true power because of the restrictions placed by the world. This meant that Li Yunmu's enemy had been just a portion of the entire spirit and nothing more, but even so, Li Yunmu had been forced to jump into the unstable and incomplete passage to Earth. Thus, he didn't hold anything back and used all of his strength to break the restrictions. The power of Azure Dragon Holy Spirit continuously slammed against the layers of Treasury protection spell. He was certain that with Azure Dragon Deadly Might, he would be able to clear the treasury before the other powers rushed over. Chapter 515, Entering Pangu City. Pangu City was the largest city of Pangu. It was their only sacred city, and the only one open for foreigners. Upon entering it, Li Yunmu met an alien race for the second time after descending to the origin world. The first one was naturally Hall clan, whose people had purple skin. They possessed a sort of unconventional yet breathtaking beauty as well as an ancient history. Pangu, however, weren't as artistic in neither their racial appearance nor historical inheritance. It wasn't beautiful, but formidable and barbaric. Li Yunmu's first impression was that Pangu of the origin world were valiant, and even more valiant. He clearly remembered that in the mythology of former China on his earth, there had been a deity called Pangu who had created many incredulous miracles. But Li Yunmu didn't know if the legendary ancient deity of Earth had some connection with Pangu of the origin world, or whether the matching names were just a coincidence. However, he didn't have any desire to perform an in-depth investigation toward this issue. He was aware that Pangu were extremely formidable. Even if they lived among countless formidable human powers, they were still considered an extraordinary power. Brother Wang, I heard that Pangu Sacred City prohibits human powers and sects from establishing their bases there. Is that right? Li Yunmu was sitting together with a young male dressed as an intellectual scholar in a beast chariot which was lined up to enter Pangu City. While closely examining the huge ancient city, he probed his companion to gain some knowledge about it. Yes, no human organization can infiltrate this sacred city. Ordinary people like us can come here without feeling inferior or being afraid of offending any flux expert. It is Pangu's sacred city, but this ancient region in the easternmost part has another name among the ordinary people. We call it Paradise Sacred City. Brother Wang, whom Li Yunmu had accidentally encountered during the journey, was speaking about Pangu's sacred city before their eyes with fascination and respect in his gaze. In truth, it was also his first time coming to Pangu City, but his knowledge about it far surpassed that of Li Yunmu. Oh? You say that Pangu are completely different from us, but they would accept humans of the lowest class into their land. Why then do they reject our organizations so firmly? Li Yunmu asked, continuing on the subject. Brother Lin, there are some facts which you should know to understand that. Since you mentioned that, you must first become aware of the basic requirements of Pangu. Wang Ren, who had the appearance of a scholar, began to speak with excitement after being incited by Li Yunmu. Given that he was also about to enter Pangu City, which he had admired for a long time, he didn't have any reservations regarding the strict human hierarchy and was talking non-stop. Li Yunmu was willing to listen to the excited chatter of the other party to obtain more information about the domain. Pangu City was indeed the same as was discussed by the people of Far East. It was a grand sacred city which everyone yearned to enter. This applied not only to Pangu themselves but also the lowest class ordinary humans who lived in the vicinity. Li Yunmu began to gradually understand the situation based on the information revealed by Wang Ren. So that's why it's like this. In the world, there was no underserved affection or admiration. Pangu were no different. The reason why they were tolerant and magnanimous toward the ordinary humans was because of their needs. Pangu needed knowledgeable ordinary humans who were proficient in all sorts of basic trades to come into their city. As long as they possessed a specialized skill and were industrious, Pangu would be willing to admit them and let them work and live in peace. It was all because Pangu were extremely lazy. None of them were willing to work in agriculture or do any other basic trades. They required a large quantity of food, however, and every year's winter was considered as most tormentous time for them. Each and every winter, many of them would die of starvation. Yes, it was starvation and not simple freezing to death. That was because those with the formidable bloodline of Pangu didn't need to fear freezing. All of their people were strong, valiant, and exceedingly tyrannical. This posed the question though, if the Pangu possessed such formidable bodies, why were they lazy to the extent that many of their people would starve to death every year? The reason behind it was quite simple, because their laziness was relative. They put all of their energy into cultivation. Yes, Pangu were actually this extreme. They would rather starve to death than halt their cultivation. Regardless of whether they were men or women, they would spend the majority of their time on bitter cultivation. For this reason, Pangu were more than willing to accept the ordinary humans to come and settle in their territory. After all, ordinary humans, especially the ones who belonged to the lowest class, worked hard in order to survive. In the past years, as the reputation of Pangu City giving preferential treatment to the bottom class humans grew, increasingly more people dragged down by having a family to feed rushed over. Because in Pangu City there wasn't any particular hierarchical structure, the bottom class people could stay with their mind at rest. But Pangu showed completely different treatment to human cultivators. There wasn't any great reason behind it except for the fact that Pangu didn't want foreign powerhouses to enter their territory. They already had enough strength and didn't want foreign powerhouses to struggle for the small number of resources in their territory. When Li Yunmu heard this, his blood ran cold, and he immediately felt that something was wrong with such a situation. It seemed like he had counted his chickens before they hatched and made a miscalculation. He shouldn't have come to such a place. Originally, he had thought that Pangu's territory would be the best choice to evade Origin God Sect and Underworld Serpent. However, he came to realize that it wasn't as ideal as he had thought. The reason for that was simple. Li Yunmu's own status was that of a cultivator. He had never thought that something like that could ever inconvenience him. If a great flux expert went anywhere in the human society, where wouldn't they be in existence detached from the world? Oh, Brother Lin, why did your complexion turn unsightly all of a sudden? Wang Ren discovered the change in Li Yunmu's expression and couldn't resist asking about it. To be honest, Brother Wang, I actually am also a cultivator. I'm afraid that I made the wrong choice by entering Pangu City. Once the matters had come to this point, there wasn't any need for Li Yunmu to conceal them. Originally, he had planned to infiltrate the city, where he could evade the omnipotent underworld serpent and also sell the large harvest obtained from Black Spirit Valley. But who would have known that before even entering Pangu City, he would bump into an iron panel. Chapter 516, The Most Formidable Race in the World. What sort of person was Wang Ren? Although he didn't belong to the lowest class, which was no different from slavery, he was part of an ordinary family. Even if he possessed a little bit of scholarly knowledge, he was only an ordinary person, an extremely ordinary person. And now he suddenly discovered that Li Yunmu, with whom he had been chatting the whole journey, was surprisingly a legendary flux expert. Wang Ren instantly began to panic, and his words also became slightly incoherent. As a matter of fact, it wasn't that Wang Ren didn't have any courage, but that the hierarchy of the human society in the origin world was extremely firm. The difference between the status of flux experts and ordinary people wasn't just a difference of a few classes. Instead, it was equivalent to the difference between heaven and earth. When Wang Ren finally managed to regain his composure, he went from talking to saluting Li Yunmu and thinking to go down on his knees. But soon, he discovered to his fright that there was a formless pressure in the air which was stopping him from kneeling down. Once he calmed himself again, he realized he'd obtained a verification that Li Yunmu was really not spouting lies. He was definitely a flux expert lord, and one with outstanding strength. When Li Yunmu saw the change in the way the man acted, he couldn't help lightly creasing his brows and sighing gloomily. Sometimes, the disparity between the position of two people was extremely large, to the point that no friendship as equals could exist between them. Although Li Yunmu didn't care much about their status difference personally, the other party could never think like that. "Brother Wang, you don't need to act like this. Cultivators are also people. This is completely unacceptable. Lord, you are a cultivator. If the word ever got that I dared to call a lord brother, my little life would be completely finished." The more Wang Ren spoke, the more terrified he became. The rigid social structure of the origin world and its way were deeply entrenched in the hearts of natives since long ago. In the end, Li Yunmu couldn't persuade the other party to change their opinion, but it was a relatively minor matter. His main concern was about the treatment received by human cultivators after entering Pangu city. He had escaped from the origin god sect with great difficulty and hadn't imagined that after coming out of the wolf's nest, he would immediately get caught in the tiger's den. Pangu's strength in the origin world was considered relatively tyrannical. Although the origin god world was formidable and had a lot of potential, it was like a minor wizard in front of a prominent one when compared to Pangu. After all, they were different from Hall clan. The tyrannical race of people which had inherited a bloodline from the ancient times made all the human powers of the origin world unwilling to provoke them. They were all afraid to become enemies with them. Because of this reason, even though Li Yunmu's strength had increased greatly and could be considered equivalent to that of initial stage sage flux expert, he still didn't dare to have any thoughts of belittling Pangu city. As the carriage drew closer and closer to the gate to enter the city, Li Yunmu had no option but to narrate his worries to Wang Ren while they waited in the line. "So the Lord is afraid of this point?" Wang Ren was unperturbed after hearing it. After some thought, he said, "Actually, if Lord doesn't have any malicious thoughts and doesn't want to cause trouble in Pangu city, there's no need for Lord to be concerned." When Li Yunmu heard the other party's words which proclaimed that the situation wasn't as bad as he'd thought, his spirits rose. "Oh? What sort of trouble?" "The trouble which humans are thought to create is mostly spying to obtain information about the exact strength and numbers of Pangu. Some people even go as far as using ordinary humans to infiltrate the city." After a pause, Wang Ren continued, "In short, if Lord is only a knight-errant, then every action you take in Pangu city should be done in an honest manner, without being secretive in any way. Pangu don't have any evil thoughts about ordinary human cultivators. In other words, if all my activities are in front of their eyes and I don't use any underhanded means, Pangu wouldn't bother with a rogue cultivator like me." Li Yunmu asked, double-checking to make sure he understood everything correctly. "Yes, if Lord is just a knight-errant, then staying in Pangu city will be very safe." Wang Ren nodded with certainty. "If I enter the city, can I still carry out business transactions involving large amounts of wealth?" Li Yunmu asked. "Oh, you will obtain the goodwill of Pangu for doing so because from some angles Lord's arrival could be seen as a contribution to improve the economy of Pangu city. But you must conduct all business transactions in an honest manner and never engage in underground dealings." "All right, I have benefited from your advice." Li Yunmu finally calmed down. It seemed like the decision to enter Pangu city to rest and reorganize himself had been a pretty good idea. In any case, from the start, he hadn't planned any petty maneuvers. Now that he somewhat understood the rules and regulations of Pangu city, this tyrannical power wouldn't cause him a disaster. If he didn't break any rules, it would even provide him an asylum for a short while. Powers at the level of Underworld Serpent and even Origin God World were, after all, unable to infiltrate the sacred city. For the moment, Li Yunmu had no place to which he could return. If he came back to Underworld Serpent, he didn't know what he should do with the information which he had obtained by entering the Origin God world. Should he sell their secrets? Even if he forgot about the favor he owed to Yuan Biao in exchange for the gift of world ancestors leaf juice, Li Yunmu wasn't a naive fool who would directly reveal all the information about the origin god world. If he truly acted in such a foolish manner, the day when origin god sect would hunt him down wouldn't be far. Underworld Serpent might obtain a lot from the information he would provide, but for him personally, it would be a catastrophe. With all his concerns about entering the city settled, Li Yunmu's mood went up a notch. Without any further worries, he began to peacefully wait in the line to enter the city. After more than half an hour, it was Wang Ren's turn to enter the city. As they neared it, Li Yunmu finally witnessed one of the most tyrannical aboriginal races of ancient times, Pangu. In the rankings of more than 1,000 aboriginal races in the origin world, they were among the top 5. The most powerful race in the origin world wasn't humans, despite humanity assuming the leadership of most of the land. It was simply that human civilization was enormous, and that the populace had an innate tendency to work hard. In the origin world, the most formidable race among the countless aboriginals was called H.A.C.K, which was a publicly known fact. Their numbers were really small, and they weren't social people. Instead, they loved to live in seclusion and would only reveal themselves occasionally. But even so, their strength was enough to stand atop all life forms. They had occupied that spot for tens of thousands of years, and in that time, no one had ever been able to threaten their position. Chapter 517, The Valiant Pangu. The second most powerful aboriginal people were Earth Devils. They spent long periods of their lives residing 30,000 meters under the surface. The temperament of Earth Devils was completely opposite of H.A.C.K, who were completely indifferent to worldly matters and didn't desire to fight. Earth Devils were in love with conquest and invading other lands, but because of the innate restriction of their bloodline, they were unable to reside under the sun. Regardless of how much they desired to invade the origin world, they could not do it. Only darkness suited them. If they appeared under the sun, their strength would drop greatly. Those who were weak might even melt and turn into a puddle of blood if they were exposed to the sunshine for a slightly longer period of time. If someone ended up encountering an Earth Devil, then they could be congratulated. They would have met someone with extremely terrifying strength, and they should quickly get away from them. Fortunately, because of the innate restriction, the probability of running into an Earth Devil on the land was extremely minute. There were few Earth Devils who possessed sufficient strength to raise people's hackles and who would occasionally come out from the ground's core. They did that to infiltrate human society and enjoy the customs of other races. The third most powerful people were humans. Pangu, in the meantime, were only the fifth among the most powerful races. The question then was why were humans, which were 2 ranks higher than Pangu in terms of comprehensive strength, were apprehensive of Pangu? The answer to this question lay in the word comprehensive. That was right, the comprehensive strength of the race didn't describe how formidable were the individuals of the race. Pangu only had some 40 million people, which was like a drop in the ocean compared to the hundreds of billions of humans in the world. However, apart from children below 3 years, all the other Pangu possessed formidable combat strength. This was the disparity between the two, and also the reason why humans had apprehensions towards some of the aboriginal races ranked in the top 10 of the most powerful races in the origin world. The reason behind it was that even though the number of human cultivators was enormous, they were spread all over the origin world. This meant that it was extremely difficult to assemble them to fight. That being said, although humanity's comprehensive strength ranked third, it was actually somewhat exaggerated. Human cultivators, naturally, weren't unduly humble. As they were concerned about the Pangu, Li Yunmu could sense that Pangu were also deeply concerned about humans. Show your identity proof, human. Soon, it was Li Yunmu and Wang Ren's turn to undergo the safety check to enter the city. 2 rows of Pangu soldiers were stationed at the gate, blocking their way. The soldiers appeared extremely strong and violent. Their temper was naturally similar to their appearance, extremely crude and straightforward. Based on the information gathered by Li Yunmu, Pangu were stubborn people. Naturally, there were exceptions to everything, but this description fit the majority of Pangu. Pangu's soldiers grew to be stronger than human barbarians. Each of the soldiers was 3 meters tall, while some were even 3.5 meters tall. Among the human barbarians, such height was extremely rare. Only if they didn't use any cultivation methods to control their height would continue to grow and become enormous barbarians as their strength increased. But even if the humans of the origin world possessed innately strong physiques, they were still far surpassed by Pangu. However, their attire and equipment were quite tattered compared to the delicate and luxurious human equipment. Pangu's soldiers were clad in skirts made of giant beast skin while their upper bodies were naked. In their hands, they held stone hatchets or spears. This could be considered as their complete set of equipment. But if someone judged them based on their appearance, they would be gravely mistaken. When Li Yunmu took a careful look at the seemingly ordinary stone hatchets in their hands, he found they were filled with an extremely bizarre and mysterious power which covered the weapon in various patterns. Pangu used the mysterious patterns which had been passed down for many generations on the stone weapons to make them terrifying. They would threaten everyone with their power, and they were also extremely sturdy. Based on this, it was clear that Pangu and the Hall clan, who Li Yunmu used runic powers on their weaponry, possessed the same type of origin. But the effects of Pangu's patterns were clearly more formidable than the runes of Hall clan. Li Yunmu only needed a single glance at the 2 rows of Pangu's soldiers lined up in front of the city for his blood to run cold. Reading countless books couldn't compare to walking around the world to gain experience. The rumors had seemed exaggerated, but they were inferior to personally witnessing the truth. From just a vague estimation, Li Yunmu was already terrified of the strength of the soldiers before him. They were emitting enormous bloodline energy, like human-sized volcanoes which were on the verge of erupting. And the carriage was right next to them. Even Wang Ren, who was an ordinary scholar, was continuously wiping the sweat off his forehead, let alone Li Yunmu whose strength was nearly equivalent to that of sage flux experts. The bloodline energy being emitted unconsciously by Pangu's soldiers was like a burning stove. It was so strong it was hard to believe it was real. System, what's their physical strength? Li Yunmu couldn't resist inquiring the system about it. Very high. Extremely high. The weakest of them possesses a strength surpassing 500 oxen. The strongest of them is close to 700 oxen. The system's reply astonished Li Yunmu. 500 to 700 oxen? Mother f***, what sort of numbers are these? Li Yunmu knew that Pangu's soldiers didn't cultivate flux energy, but that the entire race, from children to adults, cultivated their bloodline energy. In other words, they only cultivated their physical body's bloodline, which was their innate capital. Because of that, when trying to find out their genuine strength, there was no need to look at their flux energy strength, their physical strength was the thing that said it all. 500 oxen meant that the weakest of the soldiers in the 2 rows possessed 500 tons of pure physical strength. As for the ones with strength close to 700 oxen, they were even more outrageous. It had to be known that Li Yunmu's physical strength had barely broken through 160 oxen. After crossing the mark of 150, he had gradually begun to feel that his physical strength had reached a bottleneck. If he didn't have any lucky encounters, God only knew how long it would take for him to cross the barrier of 200 oxen. But the Pangu soldiers before him were very different. The system has come up with a comparison scale. 500 oxen physical strength is probably equal to 5th rank Great Flux Expert. Moreover, pure physical strength provides them with an advantage which cannot be substituted for, and it is extremely fast regeneration. With the innate Pangu bloodline, their bodies can regain their stamina pretty quickly. Moreover, 500 points of strength also provide them with a natural and extremely strong defense. If 5th rank human Great Flux Experts confronted these guards in equal numbers, then based on the system's calculations, human Great Flux Experts wouldn't stand a chance of victory. Chapter 518, Special Status. Each of the soldiers in the 2 rows possessed a strength comparable to that of Great Flux Experts. Frankly speaking, this troop was truly a little bit exaggerated. It has to be known that among the human powers, regardless of which tier of power it was, 5th or higher ranked flux experts were considered as core disciples. But here, they were simple guards. With 500 oxen strength, God only knew what terrifying impact force these people would produce with their hatchets. Seeing all those soldiers arranged by the gate, Li Yunmu understood why human powers were apprehensive toward Pangu, who possessed a population of some 40 millions. After the guard's question, Li Yunmu and Wang Ren took out their identity tiles. When Pangu's soldier looked at Wang Ren's identity tile, the tense expression on its face instantly relaxed. It was especially obvious when he realized that Wang Ren wasn't only a completely innocent ordinary human, but also a scholar who had previously engaged in teaching. A hint of rare respect appeared on the face of the large soldier. "Teacher, have you come to take permanent residence in our Pangu city? We greatly desire for people like Teacher to come and settle here. If you decide to do so, we would even provide Teacher with a generous allowance. Moreover, Teacher would never need to worry about his security," the leader of Pangu city's guards suddenly said in an extremely cordial tone, as if trying to curry favor with him. When Li Yunmu heard about the benefits and privileges offered to Wang Ren from the mouth of the crude soldier, he felt like he was in the company of a unicorn. What the actual F***CK? An ordinary teacher could surprisingly receive such great privileges after coming to Pangu city. When Li Yunmu, a great flux expert, gave his status tile to the guard of Pangu city, the man's expression sank quickly, which was something that happened quite rarely. Li Yunmu even suspected that if he hadn't been together with Wang Ren, the soldiers wouldn't have allowed him into the city. You are a human great flux expert? Why have you come here? Which human power are you affiliated to?" One of Pangu's soldiers inquired without any politeness in his voice. If a guard in any human city of the origin world had dared to take this attitude, their career would have ended there and then. That is, if the great flux expert wouldn't have killed them on the spot. After all, Li Yunmu was a great flux expert whose position was far higher than just any flux expert in the origin world. But unfortunately, he was in Pangu city, which was located in the ancient land in the Far East. Li Yunmu could only bitterly smile in his heart. It seemed like great flux experts weren't popular in all the regions of the origin world. Clearly, in the eyes of Pangu, the combat strength of great flux experts wasn't much different from their ordinary guards. "This elder brother's name is Li Yunmu, and he protected me while on the journey. Without him, I probably would have been dead long ago. He is a rogue cultivator and won't cause any trouble in Pangu city. I can vouch for him." While Li Yunmu was thinking about what to say, Wang Ren was one step ahead of him and replied in his place. It has to be said that this time, Wang Ren, an ordinary person, clearly held a much more respected position than Li Yunmu in the eyes of Pangu's soldiers. Once they heard him vouch for Li Yunmu, the dark expressions on their faces instantly softened. It was especially so when they heard that he had protected Wang Ren. From then on, they became much more lenient. But the leader of the city guards still had a hint of suspicion. According to his status tile, he was branded a traitor of a third-tier sect not too long ago. "What sort of crime did you commit that your human sect is hunting you?" The head guard didn't dare to be careless. "No crime. It was because I discovered a treasure that I got into a conflict with a descendant of a sect elder and was forced to kill him. Li Yunmu might not be able to enter the city for it, but he wouldn't let them wrong him. So he stated the facts of the matter with an attitude that was neither servile nor overbearing. Normally, the information on his status tile should have been updated to that of a silver-ranked member of Underworld Serpent long ago. However, because he had to secretly infiltrate Origin God Sect, his latest status hadn't been updated. In this region though, it only made his life more convenient. Otherwise, if Pangu's soldiers found out that he was affiliated to Underworld Serpent, a first-tier organization which specialized in assassination and espionage, the matter would have become even more complicated. Oh, then it was just your human betters publicizing their personal grudges. Nicely done. Good, seems like you have protected this teacher during the journey to Pangu city, so you can obtain entrance to the city for the time being. However, we request that you don't break any regulations. Wang Ren with his identity as a teacher possessed an important status, which had helped Li Yunmu pass much more easily than he had expected. After some thought, he said, protecting teacher Wang Ren on his way here was something I did in passing. I have obtained some harvest while traveling in the world and would like to sell a large amount of wealth in the city. That can be done as long as you don't commit any crimes. I will pass your request to my superior. Sure enough, after hearing that Li Yunmu wanted to conduct business in the city, his expression softened even more. His tone also became more polite. Li Yunmu said that he understood and moved forward. It seemed like Pangu were relatively poor. However, they were making all effort to draw support from skilled humans and settle the problem which had haunted them for a long time. The position of a teacher was especially looked upon with respect. The following procedures weren't a problem. With Wang Ren's guarantee, Li Yunmu entered the city without any hitch, even obtaining treatment which surpassed what any ordinary cultivator would receive. Once they entered the city, Li Yunmu said, "This time, I must offer my gratitude to you, Brother Wang. Lord, don't speak these words. If I, Wang Ren, hadn't been saved by you during the journey, my life would have ended long ago." Wang Ren offered his gratitude instead of accepting Li Yunmu's. His words were also true. Before, Wang Ren hadn't traveled alone. After all, in the origin world, there were many vicious beasts and other monsters in the wilderness as well as powerful bandits. No one would dare to travel without flux experts for protection. But the 3 flux experts hired by Wang Ren's group were killed by vicious beasts on the journey long ago. Li Yunmu had happened to pass by when only Wang Ren was left and saved him. He had to admit that Wang Ren's luck was quite good. "Lord, where do you plan to reside now? Do you want to come with me?" Wang Ren asked after some thought. "If that's not a bother, we could rent a small courtyard together." "I won't be staying here for long," Li Yunmu agreed. He wasn't an idiot. Since Wang Ren had a special position in the city, joining him would naturally allow him to conduct his affairs with more ease. Chapter 519, 4 Precious Treasures. With Li Yunmu's financial resources and Wang Ren's status, they quickly bought a small courtyard in a peaceful part of the city and settled there. Perhaps the Pangu city had already heard about Wang Ren's identity as a teacher from the city guards, so on the second day, a high-level character of the Pangu city paid a visit to show their sincerity and made all effort to invite Li Yunmu to take the post of a teacher in the Pangu city. Wang Ren quickly established his foothold in the strange city of a foreign race. And Li Yunmu also got peace and quiet for the time being. He could begin to work toward one of his goals for the trip, which was to sell and deal with the treasures obtained from the treasury of the annihilated Black Spirit Valley. On the third day, Wang Ren left the courtyard at dawn. Li Yunmu then entered his heavenly world. This time, he chose to not be secretive about the fact that he possessed a personal dimensional space. Of course, he had his reasons for doing this. The first one was that he knew that Pangu would definitely monitor a human great flux expert who had recently entered the city. Second, there wasn't any need for him to do so. After all, his strength was sufficient to confront sage flux experts in a battle, so naturally his concerns had greatly decreased compared to before. When he entered the heavenly world, Li Qinghong immediately went to welcome him and asked with a hint of curiosity in her eyes, "So how is it? The legendary 5th most powerful race of the origin world, are they really as valiant as the rumors say?" The day before yesterday, Li Yunmu had personally experienced the tyrannical strength of Pangu. He shook his head and replied with a bitter smile, "They outdo themselves." "No joke, are they really so fierce?" Li Qinghong was startled. She was fully aware that Li Yunmu's present combat strength was sufficient to confront a sage flux expert in a battle and was extremely surprised when she heard such an assessment from his mouth. She suddenly felt that her imagination was quite poor compared to reality. "They are extremely ferocious. If they were on our Earth, they would be considered descendants of gods, Li Yunmu said without any sort of exaggeration. According to hearsay, the children of Pangu possessed the strength of 50 oxen at the age of 5, and by the time they reached 15, their strength reached 300. In other words, even if they didn't cultivate, they would still possess the strength of first-rank great flux experts as long as they reached the age of 15. After their body had matured and came to possess the strength of 300 oxen, that was the end of their innate ability. If they didn't cultivate, they would remain at the same level. If being factual, their power would even drop as they grew old. But even so, there was no comparing them to people of his earth. There, teenagers only possessed the strength of 1 ox at most, so how could a race innately possessing the strength of 300 oxen not be classified as godlike? What else would it be called? Without comparison, one could not understand the magnitude of things. Regardless of whether it was Li Yunmu or Li Qinghong, both of them could clearly tell that the people of Earth were too weak. In front of the alien races of the origin world, they were like ants. How is it going with the treasury of Black Spirit Valley? 7 days had passed since Li Yunmu had left Li Qinghong in his heavenly world. During that time, she had been busy sorting out the objects from the treasury of the entire Black Spirit Valley. I had ape gods for help, so we've already tidied up everything properly. Moreover, the harvest this time is huge. Senior Flowing Wind even personally went through it and found 4 objects which could be considered to be rare treasures. Li Qinghong looked shaken after saying the last part. The harvest obtained after kicking down a 3rd-tier power with its own territory was so huge that she wasn't able to calculate its worth alone. Moreover, what caused her to be surprised was that the 3rd-tier power had concealed many hidden treasures. In fact, 4 of them were so precious that even Flowing Wind, an ancient god, had assessed them as rare treasures. Once Li Yunmu heard it, his eyes instantly began to shine brightly. Since God Flowing Wind had made such an assessment once after the treasures had entered his discerning eyes, they were definitely something extraordinary. Very good, quickly take me to see them. Soon, Li Yunmu arrived in front of small mountains of treasures. Most of them were arranged and classified by Li Qinghong and the ape gods. Among them, there was a lot of basic weaponry and equipment for flux experts. In Li Yunmu's eyes, these objects weren't actually worth much. But he didn't miss the fact that their numbers were enormous. All sorts of standard arms and battle armor were piled up in front of him. Altogether, there were more than 100,000 pieces, and all of them had been maintained in good condition. The system then made a calculation to roughly estimate their genuine wealth and grew excited. If everything was sold, Li Yunmu would have enough resources for more than 500 people to cultivate from initial stage flux expert layer to great flux expert layer. This reply greatly excited Li Yunmu. What sort of terrifying wealth was this? Previously, he had sold power grain a few times and had been able to barely purchase enough flux binding pills to cultivate 105 points. While in exchange for the weapons, he could offer enough resources for 500 people to quickly cultivate to great flux expert layer. Naturally, these flux experts would have only cultivated 105 flux points. The final 3 main flux points weren't included. Apart from the large amount of weapons and equipment, the treasury of Black Spirit Valley also had many flux binding pills, power grain, as well as all sorts of food used by ordinary people which could be stored for a long time. Furthermore, it also had a lot of herbs, documents, and all sorts of other treasures. But what excited Li Yunmu the most were more than 10 treasure maps collected by the Black Spirit Valley over the years of its existence. The maps had the information and geographical coordinates of various treasures. Some showed the way to where a legendary herb grew, while others the location of an extremely suspicious but unknown dimensional space. Another detailed the place where a monster with an extremely unique bloodline had set up its territory, and so on. Overall, the treasure maps recorded the locations of many objects of extremely high value. Li Yunmu took a glance at them and after roughly estimating their value put them away. Then, he finally went to God Flowing Wind's side and saw him studying 4 precious treasures with his head bowed. The first item was a yellowish original manuscript. Compared to the other treasures, it was a lot more important to Li Yunmu. Original manuscripts were definitely the most precious items for cultivators. Chapter 520, Underrated Black Ghost King Armor. Master Yunmu, you must take a look to investigate it yourself, Flowing Wind said with a faint smile while trying to show off. Li Yunmu had already begun to flip through the pages. The system secretly scanned and recorded them until he reached the last page of the source manuscript. The next instant, the extremely precious source manuscript was twisted and torn into shreds in the blink of an eye by great flux energy emitted from his hands. Li Qinghong was completely unperturbed when she saw this scene because she was used to Li Yunmu doing such inhumane acts. Flowing Wind's smile, however, froze. The source manuscript had been quite thick and contained complex content that touched upon all categories of cultivation knowledge. Even if a great flux expert opened their celestial point, which made strengthened their brains and allowed them to reach new heights, it was still impossible for them to read 10 lines at a glance and finish the manuscript so quickly. Because of that, Flowing Wind was astounded by Li Yunmu's actions. How could he know though that Li Yunmu had asked the system to scan it and record it? The source manuscript was saved perfectly within it, not missing a single image or word. Was there any necessity to keep the source manuscript then? Even if something was extremely complex and profound, Li Yunmu wouldn't need to waste his precious time and go through a lot of trouble as long as he could decipher it with the assistance of the system. As for keeping the source manuscript to sell it for a sky-high price? Although it sounded like an extremely good plan to quickly obtain a large amount of money, Li Yunmu didn't even consider it. The fewer people knew about the unrivaled and profound secret method, the better it was for him. No matter for what price he sold it, the action would show his short-sightedness. Alright, this truly is very good. I hadn't expected that a unique sacrifice refining method with such a creative concept may exist in this world. After he was finished looking at it, he still didn't have complete grasp of the source manuscript, but he understood the basics of it. He finally understood why it had caught the discerning eyes of Flowing Wind. Yes, even with all the experience of God Undercurrent, I would still call this unrivaled sacrifice refining method absolutely unique. It's an extremely rare method, Flowing Wind said while nodding. What sort of character was he? He was a wisp of soul separated from God Undercurrent. Perhaps he didn't know about some of the matters which God Undercurrent had intentionally blocked out, but Flowing Wind was still aware of tens of thousands of years of knowledge which he had gained during his existence. The unrivaled sacrifice refining method contained information in regards to how cultivators could exploit some secret treasures and refine them with a dimensional space of matching attribute. The core concept was using a treasure to place a world inside it. This concept was in accordance with Li Yunmu's storage space using an object to accommodate a small-scale space. But the sacrifice refining method stood for much larger spaces compared to the storage batch. It mainly advocated for using special treasures to refine an entire dimensional space world. It wouldn't be just a miniature space which could only store dead or non-living things. The one who used that method could refine a dimensional space or world. It had been stated previously that there were countless dimensional spaces in the origin world, but those which could be genuinely considered as such were extremely few. Only first-tier powers and sects had the strength and resources to support a world space. It was simply impossible for other powers to even think about owning one. In other words, the sacrifice refining method advocated using an object to refine a world space whose surface area wasn't smaller than that of Earth. It might even be larger, and one could place all the life forms, plants, and trees which existed in the world in it. This idea was quite crazy, which was mainly because it actually worked. The creator of this method, who was a deity, had used facts to illustrate that this concept was feasible. This left Li Yunmu extremely astonished, and even Flowing Wind felt that the method was really amazing. This special object, Li Yunmu subconsciously muttered to himself. I heard Li Qinghong say that Master Yunmu's Azure Dragon Expert Armor could suppress the creatures of Black Spirit World from resurrecting and forcefully detain them in the special space of the Expert Armor. When I heard that, I thought that perhaps Master Yunmu's Azure Dragon Expert Armor could be one of such special treasures. Under ordinary circumstances, the special treasures which fulfill the requirements of this unique sacrifice refining method, based on what I know and see, should be pointing towards some innate treasures which could hold a world, including the Heaven Stone, Origin Dimensional Stone, and Universe Cave Sand. Very clearly, we have greatly underestimated the origins and abilities of the Ghost King armor. God Flowing Wind meaningfully pointed towards it. This. Li Yunmu was shocked. But Flowing Wind's conjunction was reasonable. Of the above-mentioned objects, Li Yunmu only knew about 2. There wasn't any need to say more about the Origin Dimensional Stone which formed the base of his heavenly world. As to Heaven Stone, he had heard about such a thing. It was naturally formed precious spirit stone of the origin world. Depending on its grade, it could even be compared to World Ancestor. Its application was quite similar to that of the Origin Dimensional Stone. After God Flowing Wind's words, Li Yunmu began to think about it and finally understood the general gist of what he'd tried to say. Black Ghost King armor was indeed not as simple as he'd thought. If it didn't possess properties similar to the above-mentioned treasure and couldn't be used for refining, then why would it forcefully strip the demonic creatures of Black Spirit World of their ability to resurrect? Furthermore, how could it display the properties of the unique spaces? Yes, it should be pretty close to them. As for whether it satisfies the requirements or not, there's no harm in spending some effort and confirming it. All right, when you speak of it this way, it is clear that I should be anxious to get rid of the Black Spirit World, Li Yunmu replied after some thought. The boundary steel of the Black Spirit World was in his hands, but he wasn't afraid of people trying to snatch it away because he was in a formidable city of a foreign race, Pangu City. Besides, with Wang Ren who was looked upon with importance in the city, he was completely unworried that one of the human powers might assassinate him and steal the boundary steel. But he had just entered Pangu City and wouldn't have time to return to Black Spirit Valley for the time being to try and refine the Black Spirit World. Thus, he could only suppress his interest in his heart for the time being. Once he did so, his attention fell on the second rare treasure, which was surprisingly a red translucent fruit the size of a child's skull.